Hello again, let's talk about some famous and some best-selling books, including many historical fiction books, and let's ask the question, are they worth the hype? Hopefully by the end of this video, you'll be able to put some of these books on your TBR, and maybe, perhaps more important, you'll be able to take some of them off your TBR. Let's start with East of Eden by John Steinbeck. So this is a historical fiction book, but really it is a loose retelling of the story of Cain and Abel. It takes place mostly in Salinas, California, but also some on the east coast of the United States. You know, from around late 1800s and on into basically World War I. Now, I'd have to say that I was pretty disappointed by this book. I should have listened to my book twin. This is a good friend of mine. We have very similar reading tastes, and when I told her I was going to read this book, she was basically like, I don't like Steinbeck. Regardless, I should have listened to her. I feel like the thing about this book is that it was just really boring, mostly because I felt like the characters, they had no nuance. So this is just like kind of a pet peeve of mine in, you know, all books, whether classics like this or modern books that are written now. If there's no nuance, to me, I just feel like it's kind of stupid. I feel like the characters here, they were either basically angels sent to Earth or demons, at least the main characters. And to me, I was just like, I don't know, I just couldn't get into it. I mean, how many times can I read about basically a demonic woman? I mean, why do I want to read pages and pages and pages about what she's doing? Like, I don't care. So yeah, I didn't like this book, and if you have similar reading taste to me, you might want to skip it. Now, next up was a little romance book. Sometimes I do read romance just as a palate cleanser, so The Ex-Vows by Jessica Joyce. I mean, for me personally, I thought it was okay. If you're like a big romance reader, you probably would like this book. I mean, for me, romance kind of has to hit right, and I felt like this one was maybe just a little bit too repetitive. I felt like the author was just trying to drive home the point that, you know, if somebody loves you, then they'll take your flaws along with the things that are good about you. And while I do agree with that, I don't think that I need to be told that like over and over and over and over again, just endlessly on repeat. Like, I get it. I get it the first time. So for me, that book was a little bit repetitive. Next up, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. So this is a prequel to The Hunger Games. It focuses on the story of President Snow, how he became who he was, and ultimately I feel like it fell victim to pretty much, you know, all prequels. Prequels are so hard to do because ultimately the audience knows where it's going. Like, it lacks the mystery. And I felt like that was the problem with this book, is it lacked mystery. Like, I knew where it was going. Even if sometimes I felt that I connected to President Snow, I mean, I knew who he ultimately became, so it was all just lies. I am still going to read the prequel about Haymitch that is coming out this year. I'm looking forward to that, but I don't really have high hopes for it. Next up is Just Another Missing Person by Gillian McAllister. Now, I loved Wrong Place, Wrong Time by Gillian McAllister, so I thought I would love this one. But I felt like the difference between Wrong Place, Wrong Time and Just Another Missing Person is that Wrong Place, Wrong Time, the way that it unfolded, it was believable in terms of the main characters not knowing certain pieces of information, so you were sort of figuring out the story along with the main characters. Whereas Just Another Missing Person, I felt like it was more the author just playing with the audience and intentionally hiding things from the audience that they should have known all along, because she was writing it from a particular character's point of view. So why was this particular thing never mentioned? It was just too contrived for me, and I felt like the entire story would have fallen apart if certain things weren't withheld. I mean, they were withheld purely for the reason that you were trying to create suspense. Next up, All the Colors of the Dark by Chris Whitaker.
Just for anyone who doesn't know, All the Colors of the Dark is a smash hit mystery novel that also has a love story element. It's about a small town in Missouri in the 1970s where young teenage girls are going missing, and a boy who has one eye rescues one of them, and then what unfolds after that.
Now, this is one that I personally couldn't finish. I listened to about 30% of it, and I don't know, I just couldn't connect with the characters. I just felt like it was really forced. Like, the author was just trying to create this overly saccharine atmosphere where you just, you know, felt for the characters, but it just wasn't seamless, right? I mean, I guess there was just too much effort there. At least that was my perspective. But I know that a lot of people have really loved this book. I just feel like it wasn't particularly for me. Next up is Watership Down by Richard Adams. So this is a famous fantasy novel. It is about a bunch of rabbits who are required to leave their warren and venture out and find a new life for themselves. Now, I tried this book because I am attempting to, you know, broaden my horizons and read more fantasy. I'd say fantasy is probably the genre that I read the least amount of. You know, fantasy and maybe like fantastical science fiction. I do enjoy realistic science fiction, but fantastical science fiction I don't really read that much. So I thought I'd try to broaden my horizons with a classic, with Watership Down. And while I can say that, you know, objectively speaking, this was a great book. I can see why people love it. I can see why, certain people, they feel like it's one of their favorite books of all time. But I feel like just for me personally, I just really couldn't get into it. I guess the problem is that for me, it's just hard for me to get invested in characters that aren't humans in real life. I don't know why. I think that's just my brain. Now, I know a lot of people, they love books like that because they want stuff that's not reality. They want to escape reality. They want to, read books about dragons and dwarves and elves because they're not real. It's their escape. I guess I'm just kind of the opposite to that. Next up is White Rose, Black Forest by Eowyn Dempsey. I think that's how you say the name. I'm not sure. Now, this is a fast-paced World War II thriller. It is about a German woman who finds a downed air pilot in the forest. This woman, she's pretty disillusioned with what's going on in Germany, and she thinks initially that the airman is a German man, and I'm not giving away, this happens very early in the book. She discovers that maybe he's not who he says he is. Anyways, I actually really liked this book. I found it pleasantly surprising. It really held my attention. Sometimes with World War II historical fiction books, they can get maybe, I don't know, a little bit unrealistic, a little bit overly saccharine, I would say. But this one I felt like was, realistic enough. It was a taut thriller, and if you're in the mood for, a World War II historical fiction book, this could be a good one for you. Now let's talk about another really famous historical fiction book, or at least it's been getting a lot of hype recently, and that is Wayward by Amelia Hart.
Just for anyone who doesn't know, Wayward is the story of a lineage of women told from 3 different points of view from 3 different time periods: the 1600s in England, World War II in England, and modern day England. These women all have a way with nature and healing, and as such are targeted by the violent men who want to keep them down.
Now it's interesting. I can see why you would either really, really love this book or really, really hate this book. And I have to say that there are so many trigger warnings. I mean, there's like rape, graphic rape multiple times, abuse, abortion. If you do not like reading about that kind of stuff, really steer clear from this book. For me, I wasn't necessarily that turned off by that content, although I know that a lot of people can be. But for me, I felt like it kind of fell in the same trap that East of Eden did, where there was just, it lacked nuance. I felt like it could have used another edit, like another sweeping edit, and if there had been that edit, it would have been great. As it stands, I thought it was good, and if you can handle the content warnings, it might be worth your time if you like to keep up with what, people are reading, with, what's being chatted about in Bookstagram and Booktube and all that stuff. So that was kind of my feelings on that one. Next up is A Swim in the Pond in the Rain by George Saunders. Now this is an interesting one. I heard that this was really good on audio, and that is how I consumed this book. This is a collection of 7 short stories, short Russian stories, and it is George Saunders' analysis of these stories. He is actually a professor at the University of Syracuse, and that's what he does. He's a professor of short stories, and so he goes through these short stories and more. He goes through, I think he said maybe 22 Russian short stories as a particular class that he has at his university every year in the short story program. Now I definitely recommend this book on audio. Every short story was read by a different actor, and they weren't like super famous actors, but you probably recognize a lot of their voices. I did, and then I would Google who they were, and I'd be like, oh, that's the guy from Parks and Recreation. And then George Saunders, he narrated the rest himself. Like overall, I thought it was a good, fun lesson. I mean, ultimately, it kind of reaffirmed for me why I don't particularly like short stories, because they're really just about structure, right? It's hard to develop the character development that you need to feel compelled to keep reading them, and you feel compelled largely because of the structure of the story. So that was interesting to learn about just from the perspective of a writer. And what was interesting too is that a lot of these short stories I thought were pretty boring, and then I kept thinking to myself, I mean, am I just stupid? Like, am I just, an uncultured idiot, and I can't enjoy these, really famous stories by these revered Russian writers? But George Saunders, he kind of addressed that himself. He kind of said, don't worry, if you feel like this is boring, you're not the only one. Like, the reason they wrote it this way was because of this. And so I felt a little bit better about myself, when he said that. But overall, if you are a writer, or if you're really interested in story structure, I would highly recommend that book. Next up is Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. So this is a really famous science fiction book. It started out as a short story, and then it was made into a book, and it was basically about a man who he's mentally, like, there's something wrong with him mentally, and then he receives an operation and he becomes incredibly intelligent, like Einstein level intelligence. And then it's sort of just the story of what he experiences when he goes from somebody who is of very low intelligence up to very high intelligence, and then what happens after, and how is he treated? What is his experience in the world. And I thought it was a pretty interesting book that I would recommend because ultimately I felt like it asked the question, I mean, what is the value of a human? I mean, is a human that is highly intelligent more valuable than a human who is not? I felt like it really posed that question in an interesting and very deeply philosophical way, and it's something that I feel like is useful for all of us to ponder. So with that respect, I do highly recommend this science fiction book. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this little video. I hope you've gotten maybe a few books put on your TBR and maybe a few books to take off your TBR. And as always, happy reading.